Welcome to the History Nerd United podcast. I'm your head nerd, Brendan. Thank you so much for being here. Fellow podcaster Ian Sanders from the Cold War Conversations History Podcast. I am very picky about the other podcasters that I have on here. Ian does an amazing job. First of all, the Cold War is something that is very ignored right now. And I love the way Ian finds really interesting people with their very personal stories. And when you listen to the podcast, he's kind of like me. Let people talk and let them be interesting and just kind of guide them through the story. I love it. If you're not listening to it, you really need to. If you need more convincing, well, let's listen to Ian. Let's bring him on. And here we are with fellow podcaster Ian Sanders, Cold War Conversations podcast. Ian, thank you so much for coming on.
Well, Brendan, thank you for inviting me on. It's an honor to be chatting history with you tonight.
Wait, I'm sorry, Ian, I already screwed up. The award-winning Cold War Conversations. That's my fault. Just two quick questions. What awards did you win, and can I have some?
The award that I won was Podcast Network was running an awards scheme, and it was basically based on a public vote, but they didn't advertise it that much. And because there's an army behind Cold War Conversations, I mobilized that army of listeners and they voted, and we won the Best History podcast there. The podcast has been runner-up on quite a few other larger awards. The British Independent Podcast Awards, last year we were a finalist there, and we've been finalists for quite a number of years on various other podcasts, but we won an award at one point. So we're the award-winning Cold War Conversations.
What made you decide I'm doing a podcast? What made you decide the Cold War was going to be the subject?
Well, I've always been fascinated by history. History has, through my parents mainly. My dad served in World War II. He landed at Normandy a couple of days after D-Day, was with the British Army right the way through to the German surrender in 1945. He told me some stories, and I recorded a couple of chats that I had with him. And this was quite a number of years ago, well before Cold War Conversations. And that was probably the genesis of the idea, because I was looking around for some creative outlet. I'd done a little bit of work on a community radio station. It was just doing a sports show on a Saturday afternoon. But I really enjoyed audio and the fact that, you have to sort of concentrate if it's spoken word. You can't just sort of switch out. And I think video distracts the listener, whereas audio, you're in their head, you're right there with them. And I think you get more nuance and detail with audio because you can hear the breath and the hesitation and all the other things that go into somebody speaking or recounting their account. But I got into podcasts, and I was listening to a podcast called Spybury, which is basically a podcast about spy novels. Got a really strong community. And I got in contact with the host there. And it turned out that he was fascinated with East Germany. And he said, "Oh, Ian, you should start a podcast about East Germany." And I procrastinated for ages because you know how it is. I want to get this, if I'm going to do this, I'm going to get this right. But in the end, I thought, well, East Germany, although everybody who is asked about how to start a podcast, they say, go niche, don't try and satisfy everybody. I thought East Germany might be a little bit too niche and I might exhaust the number of options that I had there. So I decided to do the Cold War. And mainly, the reason I wanted to do the Cold War, it was my formative years. I was born in the year of the Cuban Missile Crisis, not that I knew much about it at the time, but I grew up through the 70s and 80s. And certainly in the UK, that presence of potential end of the world through nuclear weapons exchange was very heavily hanging over the heads of people. Large peace demonstrations in the UK during the 1980s, particularly around the deployment of US cruise missiles in the country. That really riled people. And I thought, a lot of these stories are not being recorded. So I started a Twitter account when it was Twitter. I'd started that before I did the podcast. And so I'd built up a reasonable following there. So I knew I had some sort of audience. And I thought, maybe I'll get 100, 200 listens to an episode or something like that. And 6-7 years later, we're at 3.7 million downloads and about 80 to 100,000 downloads a month. And no shortage of, people having an appetite for the content that I'm putting out.
What I find funny, and it sounds like you kind of had that too, is you think about niche and everything. I remember when we started this, my first concern was I'm afraid of running out of content. I'm afraid that there's only a couple of things that I can do. And what I quickly found out was that might be the easiest part is the content. The history is all there. It's how you're going to present it, how you're going to get it to people became and still is the hardest part of it.
Yeah, and it's continuing to engage with people because I know that some of my listeners prefer the military stories. No, I don't just cover military stories. I cover civilian. I cover espionage. I've had diplomats on, even astronauts. What I'm finding, though, is even the people that have come for just military will listen to some of the other episodes and actually think, actually, there's more to this. This helps give context, these other episodes. So, the podcast has continued to grow over those 6 years, and I hope it will grow further. But one area that always frustrates me is my audience in the US is not as big as I think it should be. So my audience is about a third UK, a third US, and the next largest is Australia, I think, with about 7 or 8%. And I think, hang on, well, the size of the population of the US is much bigger than the UK. Why aren't there more people out there? So Brendan, that's why I want to be on your podcast. I want to grow. I want to be a hit in the US.
Ian, I hate to burst your bubble here, but we're not close to 1 million yet. We'd love it. But hey, what I have found too, though, but especially it's history, and that's something when you talk about these history podcasts and what we're doing is depending on what you're doing, these numbers are completely different, right? Because with history, there is a certain amount of people that are going to listen. There's a certain amount of people that you kind of got to talk into it, which, especially for History Nerds United, we want to reach those people who think history is boring and kind of changing that up. And I mean, just like yours, you had a freaking astronaut on, like an astronaut. Like even people were like, history is boring. They're like, wait. I think it was an astronaut is on there. Like how did that come about that all of a sudden you're going to be talking to an actual astronaut?
Well, it wasn't just any old astronaut. It was one of the crew of Apollo 13, which is one of my favorite movies. Love that film. It comes the usual way, really, is you email them or you contact them through social and you think, it's never going to happen, but you got to go for it. And blow me, Fred Hayes emailed me and gave me 2.5 hours of his time. And it was such a fascinating chat. I mean, he's one of these people who's told his story so many times. So he's well rehearsed. There's very few questions you ask which he hasn't already been asked. I think there was 1 or 2 questions. I remember one of them was I asked him, what did he take up into space with him? What did friends ask him to take up into space with him, which I think he'd not been asked before, but I find that hard to believe. I mean, the preparation for that, I was, it was a real fanboy. I mean, I can't believe I'm speaking to this guy. And he was so nice. And I was really cheeky with him. I actually got him to do a sort of, this is Fred Hayes, you're listening to Cold War Conversations. And I need to dig that audio out because I need to be using that as a promo. It was absolutely fascinating. I think the other one, which frustrates me that it doesn't get that many listens, is I managed to interview the son of Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet leader. And he was 20 odd years old when Khrushchev was in power. So he was an adult. He traveled with his father on some of the overseas trips that his father did. So his father did share to him some of the stresses and strains that he was dealing with around Cuban Missile Crisis and the Berlin crisis. And it's a 2-part episode. I think what may be difficult for the listener is that he's got a relatively strong Russian accent there. But once you tune in, you sort of get what's going on. It was one of my earlier episodes and probably the audio's not as hot as some of the later ones, but he tells a fascinating story. And some of the people he met, he saw Stalin in Red Square at one of the parades. He met Beria, the head of the KGB, because his father was good friends with him. Just loads of fascinating detail. But that interview came from me contacting Gary Powers Jr., who's the son of the U-2 pilot who was shot down in 1960. I should know the date of this, 1961, I think it is. I interviewed him, great interview, told me loads of detail about his father. At the end of the interview, and this is what I do with all of my guests, is I say, do you know anybody else who you think might be interested in coming on the show? And he says, how would you like to interview the son of Nikita Khrushchev? And as you can imagine, it didn't take me very long to say yes. And he came on, and it was a funny start to the interview because I'd sent him the questions in advance. And Sergei Khrushchev, he comes on the line, and the first thing he says to me, he says, your questions are very naive. And I'm thinking, oh, great, this is a really good start here.
It's a very Russian tone right there. That makes sense.
Yeah. And I said, look, I know a lot of the answers to these, but my listeners don't necessarily know the answers. So that's why I'm asking these questions, because it gives context to the interview and leads the listener through the interview. And I don't know whether you find this, but I found that after about 10 minutes, he warmed up because he relaxed into it, knew that I wasn't going to try and trip him up, that it was a friendly interview, but I did want some answers to various questions. And it was amazing. And I used that interview as a calling card for quite some time. It works in two ways because, you can use it as a calling card and then somebody would say, well, hang on, I'm not Nikita Khrushchev. Why? I'm not Nikita Khrushchev's son. Why would you want me on? I said, well, because you're a teacher in East Germany and people are interested to know what it would be like teaching in East Germany and teaching Marxism, Leninism or something, something like that.
What I especially like too about Cold War conversations is what you kind of just mentioned. You have some just absolutely huge names from the Cold War, but you also just, like you said, East German teacher, somebody who is working at a missile silo or something like that, which I kind of like what we do at History Nerds as well, which is I've been honored to interview Pulitzer Prize winners, but also a bunch of authors who their first book is coming out. And I'm sure you find the same thing, is you want to be able to give just this wide swath of experiences and perspectives so that people can hear different things that they may not necessarily think they would even be interested in, but hey, they hear a little bit of a conversation and all of a sudden they want to know more.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I do quite a lot of author interviews because I want to have the variety in there, a variety of different voices, because it would be very easy for me to do a podcast just on spies. And there's some great podcasts out there that do that. But I like the variety. And, what I'm looking for in an interview is a line like, oh, I've never thought about that. Oh, yeah. Let me tell you about that now, because it's new ground. It's not something that they've rehearsed somewhere else. It's triggered some long, distant memory. And hopefully there's going to be a nugget of gold at the end of that thread.
Now, I want to ask, this is a really unfair question, but I'm going to put you on the spot here. If you could interview any one person that was a huge part of the Cold War, living or dead, who would be your number one? You get an hour with them. And I'll even say this, if you choose somebody like Stalin, he has to answer truthfully for that entire hour.
Living or dead? God, dear.
I know this is unfair.
The obvious ones would be for Kennedy or Stalin or something like that. But I'd probably want to go for Yuri Andropov, who was the Soviet leader after Brezhnev, because I'd want to ask him about this paranoia that he had that the US were actually going to launch a first strike on the Soviet Union. I did an episode on this. Basically, the sort of year where this gets really dangerous is 1983. And the Soviets have an intelligence operation to look for signs that the US is going to attack them. There's various things that happen in 1983, and the sort of climax of it is a NATO exercise called Able Archer, which is a practice for the launch of nuclear weapons against the Soviet Union. During that exercise, the Soviets went to a higher degree of readiness that had been seen before. They had planes loaded with weaponry at the end of runways ready to attack NATO. And there's NSA documents to show that this was the intelligence that was showing at the time. And I'd like to understand his thinking and where he was going with that. And also his views on Gorbachev, because Gorbachev was Andropov's protege. He was the guy that Andropov wanted to succeed him. How did he think Gorbachev was going to develop the USSR? I'm sure Andropov had no idea he was effectively going to dismantle it. But I guess that's the person. If I had a little bit more thought about it, I may go for somebody else. I mean, as far as living people who are still around, Gorbachev would have been top of my list. I think now I would love to speak to Lech Walesa, the leader of the Free Trade Union Solidarity, that really started the unraveling of the Iron Curtain in 1980 when they were legalized by the Polish communist government because they knew that they had to work with them in some shape or form. And then in 81, martial law was declared and Solidarity had to go underground. But eventually the Polish communist government realized we've got to work with these guys. And there were free or semi-free elections for the first time in Poland in 1989. Obviously in 1989, the whole of the Warsaw Pact, sort of communist governments in the Warsaw Pact, fell apart and disappeared. So there's hope because I have a number of financial supporters who support the podcast. And one of them is sort of like teasing me to say he knows somebody who knows Lech Walesa, and he may be able to do something there. I'm not raising my hopes, but that would be worth the plane trip to Poland to do that face to face.
Now, one of the things I love about the way you interview your guests is you're pretty minimalist, right? Like you put it to them to kind of fill in all the gaps and everything. So when I think of a dream guest for you, and I had to double check his name, Vasily Arkhipov, the submarine commander who could have started World War III and basically didn't because he stuck to his guns. An amazing story. One of those things that it happened, and if you know the Cold War, you're going to know that story, but it's not something that everyone knows. I feel like he would be cool, especially for you, because you're very good at asking questions and then just letting the guests kind of come to you with that information and kind of open up from that perspective.
Yeah, I mean, I sort of joke that my job is to press the record button. That's all I do. As you've commented, what I do is I just try and nudge the guest along. It's not about me, it's about the guest. So I just nudge them along and try and construct the episode in a way that's going to be easy to edit for a start, because I do all the editing as well, and make sense to the listener, even if they don't know anything about the Cold War. I do sort of assume a certain level of knowledge for the listener, but I have started adjusting that slightly with some of my more recent episodes where, there's acronyms coming in and things like that. And I add a voiceover saying this means XYZ or something like that. Arkhipov would be good, although I did interview Sir Max Hastings, actually, the author, and he did a book last year called The Abyss about the Cuban Missile Crisis, and he cast some doubt as to whether the events with Arkhipov were as critical or as dramatic as some of us like to make out.
I mean, that's the thing with historians. They're always trying to ruin great stories. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, the fact that these submarines were armed with nuclear torpedoes is incredible enough. I mean, the US Navy, who was basically, this was during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and the US Navy had blockaded Cuba, and US warships were given orders to make any Soviet submarine surface. And the way that they tried to get them to surface was by dropping training depth charges. Now, a training depth charge explodes. So if you're in a submarine, it doesn't sound hugely different or if you've never been depth charged, you don't know that that's just a training depth charge going off. You might think, wow, that was a bit of a near miss. So, there was real danger of escalation during that period. And through the incredible vision of Kennedy in terms of managing that situation, they managed to get away with it. But there's a number of situations where it could have really gone pear-shaped or mushroom cloud-shaped, actually, is what I should say.
This is kind of a gigantic question, and I don't know how to kind of break it down into parts. But prepping for this, I kept thinking, you know what? I look at the Cold War from an American perspective. Pardon my jingoism, right? It was the U.S. versus the USSR. Being a British person, do you see the Cold War the way we did, right? There was as much paranoia or things like that? Because, on the one hand, Cuban Missile Crisis, there were missiles right there. But I mean, if you're in Europe, anywhere in Europe, you're right near there. Like it's just a little bit across the water and things like that. So I always kind of wonder, it was us versus them, and that was a thing. From the UK perspective, was it just like it's us in the US versus the USSR, or was it more of a gray area than it was for Americans?
You're right. I mean, geographically, it was really close to us. And, we were nicknamed the Unsinkable aircraft carrier because we had loads of US bases, particularly in the east of England, for, aircraft like the F-111 and aircraft like that. So the US forces were a very big part of those local economies. But as I sort of said before, there was quite a significant opposition to US nuclear weapons in the UK. And also the UK's nuclear deterrent, which was submarine-based through most of the Cold War on Polaris submarines. That was from the late 60s. It was aircraft delivered prior to then. But we're a very small country, so it would just take a few hits of nuclear weapons to completely wreck the country, and effectively the UK would cease to exist. Whereas it's very easy to look at the map of the US and think, well, some areas will probably be okay, but in the UK that was going to be very unlikely. I mean, you might imagine, Scotland's going to be okay. It's pretty wild and remote up there, but hey, there's a big US submarine base up there, so that was going to be a target as well. So we also had our army in Germany, the British Army of the Rhine, which was basically a successor to the occupation forces that were in Germany at the end of World War II. We were regularly exercising with NATO allies, US, as well as the West Germans and the other allies there. So it was sort of constantly in the news in some shape or form. But we didn't have things like duck and cover and stuff like that. But we did have a fantastic civil defense pamphlet that was going to be distributed if war was imminent, called Protect and Survive. And basically that said, you need to build your own nuclear shelter in your house. And the guide indicated that you just needed to take a few of your doors off the hinges, lean them against a wall and pile a few sandbags on top of them and disappear in there with a bucket, a can opener and some cans of food and water, and everything would be okay. Needless to say, it was widely ridiculed in the UK. And I think I've still got a copy of one here actually somewhere, but it's a good comedy read.
Yeah, in case nobody has ever looked at that stuff, none of that was going to work. I always found it when I was in the Army, I was a tanker, and there's hand signals in case the radios go down. And my favorite hand signal was if you wanted to let another tank know that a nuclear blast has happened, you just covered your eyes. And it was very funny to look at it because you're just saying, it's like, yeah, cover your eyes because it's over. Forget it. Don't worry about whatever you're going to do. It's too late. Everything is over with. Kiss your butt goodbye, basically.
Yeah, I mean, when I interview, tankers, for example, and, I ask them about the NBC procedures and stuff like that, it was sort of like, if we start lobbing tactical nukes around, it is game over for everyone. I think that I interviewed somebody and they said, we were told that if a tactical nuke went off, we had to measure the size of the mushroom cloud to radio back so that they could work out what kilotonnage it was. But, I think this was just sort of like a placebo to try and make these soldiers think there was potentially something that they would still be able to do that would be useful.
Now, maybe it's better now than when I was in, but I was in 2004 to 2009, and my systems never worked. All of the stuff for chemical, biological, nuclear, it never worked. So it was just kind of like, if that's going to happen, say a couple of prayers, close your eyes, hope you're close enough to the blast that it's all over as soon as possible, as opposed to a very slow death. But on that positive note, did you think Cold War conversations would go this big? Speaking of mushroom clouds, right? Like we talked about those numbers and everything. We've talked about it, but I have to think you got to be sitting there going, it looks like you're not going to slow down anytime soon, and these numbers keep happening. Did you think that was possible when you started this?
Not at all. I thought that, as I said, I maybe get a few hundred downloads an episode and, there'd be a niche interest in it. But I never had any idea it was going to be the numbers that it is. And I think the one thing that I probably would have done differently is not released weekly. So I have an episode every week, and I have produced and got that out since 2018 without fail. And the listeners have got used to that cadence. And I get emails from people who they email me and they say, I always look forward to a Saturday evening, Cold War Conversations, new episode has arrived. I sit down with a whiskey or cup of tea or whatever, and I listen to that episode. And I never thought I would have that responsibility, that I become a regular fixture in their life. You know, it's something that they look forward to hearing, the latest episode. But they do. And I think it's a combination of a couple of things. I think there's obviously people who are interested in the history of that period, but I think there's a lot of nostalgia there. I think I have a lot of listeners who lived through the same period as me and just want to go back to it in some shape or form. In some ways, it was a simpler world. You know, there was no social media then. And the enemy was much more certain, in so much that the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact were the enemy. There wasn't talk of asymmetric warfare or anything like that. And it seemed like the Soviet Union would be there for forever. You know, it wasn't going to disappear anytime soon. But as we know, 89 to 91, the rules of the game changed. You know, the Gulf War and the war in Afghanistan and 9/11, you know, the whole way that the world was completely changed, and there were now a whole host of dangers for us and the US all around the world.
I wonder, do you realize, and I'm sure that people have said this to you, how far ahead of the curve you are? Because it feels like, especially as history is concerned, people are now just realizing that for people who saw World War II, we're losing them, right? It's almost gone, right? And the Cold War is something that I don't think we focused on as the way you do with specific people and all of that stuff, that you're so far ahead of the curve that you're going to be able to get these stories, as opposed to, you know, right now, you'd have to find a 90-year-old World War II vet to be able to get these stories. Was that something that you were thinking in your head when you did it, or it was just, Cold War is interesting, I'm doing it?
No, that was one of the primary reasons. I wanted to get as many stories as I could before these people were no longer able to tell their stories. I mean, you know, I've interviewed veterans of the Korean War. Now, that was the 1950s. And, you know, there's not many of them still around. I've had a couple of situations where I've organized an interview, and then I've had an email from a relative or somebody else who had access to that interviewee's mailbox to say, I'm sorry, he or she is no longer here. And, you know, that increases the urgency. But, you know, I can only interview as many people as I can interview. So I think, you know, the areas that I would like to do more of is the view from the other side. So I do have a number of interviews with East German military, Polish military, some Soviet military. And in fact, with the Soviet side, I did an experiment just the other day where I used a translator. So I'm going to see how that goes. It loses its immediacy, and it loses a lot of the rapport, which I think is one of the strengths of my podcast is that interaction I have with the guests, because I like a little bit of humor where I can. Obviously, some of the subjects are dark, you know, particularly people who are in the army, because there's always some crazy scrape that they got into, or, you know, they got arrested, or, you know, there's always something like that in there that you can have a laugh about. But the view from the other side, I think, is important. But I'm reliant on English speakers at the moment, and there's obviously not that many. And I'd like to cover the proxy wars, like the wars in Angola and in Africa, you know, Nicaragua with the Contras and that sort of side of things. There's, as I said at the start, there's no end to the stories that I can cover, but I don't want to be too Eurocentric. So I do cover a lot in Europe, you know, a lot of interviews with US military personnel. They're a little bit more, I get a lot of emails from US military, more than from British people. But, you know, British people can be quite reticent and don't really want to share too much. But, you know, I'm welcome to any story really about the Cold War. Everybody has their own view and has their own unique stories, and I will keep going as long as I can.
Are you ever worried that you might interview somebody and end up on a list? Like you talk to somebody who was probably maybe former KGB and all of a sudden you're on Putin's list. Does that ever concern you?
Not really, no. I think I'm insignificant enough not to worry the likes of Putin, but I did get so I have a voicemail where people can leave messages on there, and I did get a voicemail, and it was a Russian woman's voice leaving the voicemail, and she said, "I am Svetlana, my husband was KGB. I'd like you to tell his story." And I thought, this sounds like a bit of a wind-up. It sounded like a made-up voice. Anyway, I contacted a friend of mine who's more knowledgeable about intelligence matters than I am, and he said, no, she's the real deal. She's the wife of Oleg Tumanov. So I did an incredible interview with her. She was in Moscow at the time. And the short story is that she's a young Russian girl in London. So her parents have managed to emigrate out of the Soviet Union. They were Jewish refuseniks. She's in London. She gets a job at the BBC. She's about 18, 19, and she meets a guy there who's the head of Radio Free Europe, or Radio Liberty, I think. It's Radio Free Europe, or Radio Liberty. Anyway, one of the US propaganda stations beaming into the Eastern Bloc. Falls in love with him, marries him, sells her flat, and basically has put everything into a relationship with this guy. 1 week after they get married, he takes her to one side and says, I need to tell you that I've been working for the KGB for the last 10 years. So she has to decide, does she inform the authorities about him, or does she stay with him? And because she loves him and because she's thrown her lot in with him, she continues to stay with him. She then gets a job teaching Russian to US diplomats in Germany. So she's picking up information that she's passing to her husband, who's then passing them to the KGB. And it's just a phenomenal story. And when I started the podcast, I didn't think I was going to be speaking to KGB agents, but I have. I think one of the most interesting ones was Jack Barsky, who was a KGB illegal in the US for about 10 years. So he entered illegally through Canada. He was an East German citizen originally, entered illegally through Canada, built a false identity, was like a dispatch rider around New York, eventually got a job in a software company. And his story, you've seen the series The Americans, I'm presuming. Yeah. So it's almost exactly that sort of story, except there's a lot less killing going on than there is in The Americans. It's a fascinating story because he's basically having to manage various different personalities because he marries a US woman. So he's got a wife in East Germany who he periodically visits. He's married to this woman in the US. His work colleagues obviously don't know that he's a KGB agent, and he's having to manage all of these different personalities. And it's a great, great story. I do enjoy the espionage ones, but I think that the ones that I enjoy are the ones where no one's ever heard their story before.
Oh, yeah. I think Svetlana's story should be a Netflix documentary. Now, I can already see it. It should be the Tindler Swindler Cold War edition. I think everybody would watch it. Well, you know what? Speaking of TV, I just want to ask this one as we're talking. Have you seen For All Mankind?
I haven't got an Apple subscription, but I have watched chunks of it on YouTube. And I love it. I love it because I love space stuff anyway. And I've done various episodes on the space race. I did the Apollo 11 moon landing. I did the Apollo Soyuz mission, which was where the Soviets and the Americans did a joint mission, docked in space, shook hands, and that was about it. But it was a major, during the Cold War, that was just incredible. And I think also a lot of people don't realize is that Kennedy at one point said to Khrushchev, the Soviet leader, let's do a joint mission to the moon. And Khrushchev declined his offer. Apparently, it's because Khrushchev was worried that the US would realize how primitive the Soviet base systems were. But yeah, For All Mankind looks brilliant. Brilliant premise, brilliantly delivered. And I love alternate histories as well.
It's very interesting, I should say. I think if you watch it all the way through, I had to turn my history brain off because for anybody who hasn't seen it, the conceit is the Russians get to the moon first and it changes all of that stuff. But it's on season 4. And the alternate history, for me, I have to turn my brain off for. Because a lot of things happen where you're kind of like, well, even if the Soviet Union got to the moon first, like this stuff wasn't going to happen. And then, of course, there's a lot of soap opera stuff in between. But the space stuff is cool as hell. I mean, no show is doing the space stuff better than what they're doing. But I digress. Sometimes you got to just turn your history brain off and just let it wash all over you.
Well, people often have arguments about movies based on historical events. My view is they're always going to take shortcuts because the story can be quite complicated and they want to be able to explain it easily to a viewer that doesn't necessarily know that piece of history. But if it gets that person's interest and they want to learn more, then they may well come to Cold War conversations or come to History Nerds to learn more about that particular piece of history. So yeah, it can irritate you and you can yell at the TV when you're watching this stuff. But if it gets people interested in that period, then they can learn more and learn what the true stories are of that period.
The History Nerds United, we want people to understand history is fun. It's not that class that you took in high school where you felt bored and you just had to memorize these dates. If I took somebody who said history is boring, and I sat them in front of you and they said, why should I listen to Cold War Conversations? What would you say?
Okay, probably one line would be my answer. And there's nothing like hearing history from somebody who was there. So you hear their experiences in their own words. And it's sort of like I said at the start, you hear their hesitations, their breath, sometimes their tears. In the interviews that I do, you hear the emotion there and you can't help being moved by that. I mean, I've got an amazing interview next week with a guy who lived in Poland, German name, but was Polish nationality. So he had a real hard time at school. His father managed to get to the US and brought the family over to the US. And it's a powerful and moving story of the trauma that he experienced being moved away from everything he knew to San Diego and, his father washing dishes despite the fact he had a law degree in Poland and was, a really, potentially a really good businessman. But at the end of it, he sort of talks about, I now understand why my father did that. He thought he was doing the right thing, but at the time, it didn't feel like that to me. And there's one scene that he describes leaving his town of Poznan, and he says, I was looking out the window and I could see the city that I knew, the only city that I'd ever known, disappearing out of the window. And I was just moving on into the unknown. And hearing that with just audio, just the words and hearing those pauses is just such a strong way of communicating what it was like. And that's really what history is about, is what was it like at that time? How did those events happen? And I think it's the personal side of those events. So I don't tend to cover the big strategic stuff. I'm much more interested in the down in the weeds and, what was it like shopping in East Germany? How long did you have to queue? What were the shortages of? And that sort of level of detail. And with the military stories, what was the food like? How do you go to the loo if you're on a tank? That's what my listeners want. They want that level of.
I have the answer to that one too.
Detail. Yeah. So have I. I was astonished by it. But anyway, you'll have to listen to my episodes if you want to learn the truth of that. There's nothing like hearing history from somebody who was there.
Well, Ian, I love the podcast. Thank you so much for coming on. I'm telling everybody to listen to it.
Well, thank you, Brendan. I appreciate it. I'm hoping to obviously make a major incursion into the US, build my listenership. And I'm delighted to be able to share my story of both, how the podcast began and talk to a fellow history fan.
And that's it for this episode. Ian, thank you so much. It's Cold War Conversations History Podcast. It's everywhere. Go listen to it. 5 stars, people. Heads up. Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. Go on YouTube. You know the deal, people. Until next time, nerds, stay cool.
History Nerds United.